Hi guys, my name is Minhajuddin Ansari and you're watching the 14th tutorial on C++ programming, and today I will be talking about nesting of loops. So when one loop is placed inside the body of another loop, then this is called nesting of loops. And for each iteration of the outer loop, the inner loop has to execute completely. Now there are different types of loops, nested loops. There is the nested for loop, nested while loop, nested do while loop, and a nested combination of different loops. And I will be giving you examples of each of these loops. So let's first start with a nested for loop. So I'm going to write my outer for loop, and I'm inside the body of the outer for loop, I'm going to write my inner for loop. And inside the body of my inner for loop, I'm simply going to print my name. So what's happening here? Initially, the value of I is equal to 0. Now this I belongs to the outer for loop, and the condition is satisfied, I is lesser than 10, so the body of the outer for loop executes. Now inside the body of the outer for loop, there is another for loop. So that means this for loop has to execute completely. So again, j is equal to 0. Now this variable belongs to the inner for loop and the condition is tested, which is true, and minhaj is printed and j is incremented, and this goes on until minhaj has been printed 10 times by the inner for loop. And once the inner for loop has terminated, that means once the value of j becomes 10, then the outer for loop's I will again increment. So it will become 1. And again the condition will be tested, 1 is lesser than 10. So again the inner for loop will run 10 times and print minhaj 10 times. After it has terminated, again I would be incremented to 2, condition will be tested, and the inner for loop will print minhaj 10 times again. So this will happen. The outer for loop is running 10 times from 0 to 9. And the inner for loop is also running 10 times from 0 to 9, and it is printing minhaj in the output screen. That means both loops are running 10 times. So minhaj would be printed in the output screen 100 times, because for each iteration of the outer for loop, the inner for loop prints minhaj 10 times. So since the outer for loop is running 10 times, so minhaj would be printed 100 times in the output screen. So when I run the program, you're going to see minhaj printed 100 times, and I can scroll this upwards. So this is the nesting of for loop. Now there's also a nesting of while loop. So let me first define my integer variable I is equal to 0. And now I'm going to write my outer while loop, and the condition should be that I should be lesser than 10. Let me also define another variable j is equal to 0. And inside the body of my outer while loop, I'm going to write my inner while loop, and its condition should be that j should be less than 10. And inside the body of my inner while loop, I'm going to print my last name. So this is an example of a nested while loop. And simply what you have to do is that you have to increment the value of the variable j and the variable I. So now what's happening here? Initially the value of I is 0. 0 is lesser than 10, condition is true. Now the inner while loop runs. Now the inner while loop runs from 0 all the way to 9. So initially j is equal to 0. So the condition would be tested, 0 is lesser than 10, Ansari would be printed, j would be incremented to 1, and this would go on and on and on until Ansari is printed 10 times. So the final value of j, when the inner loop would terminate, the final value of j would be 10. So now I would increment and I would become 1, and 1 is lesser than 10. So again, this time the inner while loop will not execute, because the value of j is still 10. We haven't resetted the value of j. So 10 is not lesser than 10. This condition will become false, and I would be incremented to 2. 2 is lesser than 10. Again, the value of j is still 10. The value of j is 10 because the first time the inner while loop executed, it changed the value of j from 0 all the way to 10. And then the value of j just remained 10. It was not resetted again. So in order to solve this issue, what you can do is that each time the inner while loop runs and completes its execution, you can reset the value of j. So what will happen here is that initially I is equal to 0, 0 is lesser than 10, and j is equal to 0 as well initially, and 0 is lesser than 10. So the while loop runs 10 times and prints Ansari in the output screen, and then j becomes 0 again, and I is incremented to 1. So 1 is lesser than 10, condition is true, and since j has been reset to 0, that means the inner while loop will run again, and it will again print Ansari 10 times, and again the value of j will be reset to 0. So again, when the value of I is incremented to 3, 3 is lesser than 10, condition is true, and again the inner while loop executes. So just keep in mind that when using the while loop and the do while loop, you have to reset the inner loop variable in order for it to run for each iteration of the outer loop. So when I run the program, Ansari is going to be printed in the output screen 100 times right here. And if I did not include this line, so if I had removed this line, Ansari would only be printed 10 times, because the loop would not run again in the second and third and fourth iteration of the outer loop. So it would only run once, and Ansari would only be printed 10 times. So make sure you reset your value to 0. And now the third type of nested loop is the nesting of do while loops. And it's the same thing as the nesting of while loops. So I'm not going to go into that much detail. Simply add inner do loop inside your outer do loop and add your statement. I'm going to print again minhaj and line, and I'm going to increment the variable j inside, and I'm going to increment the variable I outside, and my condition will be while I is lesser than 10 for my outer do while loop, and for my inner do while loop while j is lesser than 10. Make sure you add the semicolon, and one more thing, make sure you reset the value of j so that the do while loop can execute for each iteration of the outer do while loop. So when I run this program, again, minhaj will be printed 100 times in the output screen. So right here. And now the final type of nesting is a nesting of different types of loops. So let me first write a for loop for int k is equal to 0, k is lesser than 10, and k plus plus. And inside the body of my outer for loop, I'm going to write my inner while loop. While I is lesser than 10, and I'm simply going to see out cheese pizza. And line, I'm going to increment the value of I, and outside the while loop, inner while loop, I'm simply going to reset the value of I to 0. So again, this would print cheese pizza 100 times in the output screen. So this is all it about nesting of loops. And I mean, you guys have noticed that I have accidentally written 2 semicolons right here. It doesn't matter. If you write 1, I mean, there's no issue at all. So don't worry about that. I might have mistyped. So that's not an issue. So this is all it about the nesting of loops. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comment section, and thanks for watching this video.